Hi, I'm Auntie TC, and this is Black History for Everyone. Happy Juneteenth! Juneteenth occurs on June 19th each year. It's a holiday widely celebrated in African American communities all over the United States. You may see parades, cookouts, and other cultural and heritage celebrations in the so-called black part of your city. But what is Juneteenth really about? Well, you may have heard that African Americans used to be slaves. Contrary to popular belief, most slaves in the U.S. were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Unfortunately, the most famous executive order was nothing more than a bunch of lawyer double talk. In the day-to-day lives of slaves, little changed until the Confederacy started bleeding out. When General Lee surrendered at the Battle of Appomattox in April of 1865, it was on the condition that his men were allowed to return home and not as prisoners. And usually this meant they had to give up their slaves per the Emancipation. As you can imagine, in the 1860s, it took some time for word to come around that the war was essentially over. There were some battles that happened in North Carolina, in Alabama, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Texas, but eventually all official Confederates surrendered by late June. In January of 1865, the 13th Amendment passed Congress and was on its way to becoming ratified by the states. It would be fully ratified by December of 1865, with several former slave states joining in after Republican governments took over. As you can imagine, this was a thorn in white Southerners' sides for decades to come. The 13th Amendment is a video for another time, but it's a prime example of why words matter in legislation. But for the most part, it outlawed slavery. Sort of. In fact, new evidence suggests that in several remote parts of the South, a de facto slavery existed well into the 1960s. But that's also a video for another time. So on June 19, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger and his Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas to give an official word that the Civil War was over and that all slaves in Texas were finally free. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and free laborer. While Juneteenth started as a Texas-specific holiday, it soon came to represent the hundreds of emancipations that happened across the old slave South. Juneteenth rose in popularity during the late Jim Crow era into the Civil Rights era. During Jim Crow, there were laws in place that prevented African Americans from gathering in large groups, so celebrations were small or centered around churches, the only places blacks were allowed to gather without suspicion. Today you can find a Juneteenth celebration in nearly every major American city, but they are most prominent in the South, especially in black majority cities, that cities where African Americans make up the majority of the population. Juneteenth is a partially inclusive holiday, meaning that in most circumstances, such as a public parade, non-black people are welcome to join into the festivities. But Juneteenth serves as both a teaching holiday and a holiday celebrating blackness in the face of extreme adversity. So if you are not black, there may be some elements of Juneteenth that may make you racially uncomfortable. But as long as you can participate with an open mind, an open heart, and open ears, you will be invited to join in on the fun. That's all I have for today. Please like and subscribe, and have a happy Juneteenth. Bye!